firing the messenger. President Trump firing the top official behind the government's jobs numbers. It is a stunning and an unprecedented move in the United States, coming just hours after the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is, around the world, the most trusted gold standard.
I do that on the basis of safety for our PA threat was made by a former president of Russia. And we're going to protect our P all right. The threat that he is referring does come from the former Russian president. Also now very senior in the Russian Defense Department, Dmitry Medvedev. He is now the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. And Medvedev said, and I quote, "Remember his favorite films about the Walking Dead, as well as how dangerous a dead that does not exist in nature call now. The dead hand is a reference to Russia's hand system. Basically, even if you knock everybody out with a nuclear strike, the Kremlin is destroyed. The system will automatically feed that's the dead hand pushing the and it comes as Russian." President Vladimir Putin tonight said this: "Russia isn't capturing territory, we are returning what's rightful." I want to go straight to Natasha Bertrand. She's at the Pentagon, and our Nick Walsh, who is on the ground in Kyiv, is also with us for this breaking news on this Friday. Natasha, Trump is doubling down on this. Right, sending nuclear submarines toward Russia. Obviously, when you think about the context of what Putin is saying, this couldn't come at a more fraught time. Yeah, I mean, this is a very thinly veiled threat, not just by Medvedev, but also by President Trump. And it may be an empty one because we don't actually know where these submarines are. That's by design. We may never know, because their location at any given time is one of the most closely held secrets by U.S. military officials. That's why the location of these submarines is very rarely publicly discussed. But, we also don't know what kind of submarines President Trump is talking about. All of the Navy's submarines are nuclear-powered, but only about 14 of them can actually carry nuclear warheads, so that part is unclear as well. They do regularly carry out patrols in international waters, and they can hit targets thousands of miles away. So, if President Trump really wanted to launch some kind of strike on the Russians, he could have done it without publicly telegraphing it, and of course, without even moving them any closer to Russia than they already are as part of their routine patrols. But at the very least, this is a very clear message to the Russians at a highly sensitive moment in Washington-Moscow relations, especially because of tensions over peace talks with Ukraine that simply are not materializing, as President Putin continues to ignore President Trump's entreaties to come to the table. And Nick, you're on the ground in Kyiv. Medvedev thrives on provocation, right? Dire nuclear threats, which are not nothing, but most world leaders dismiss them as unserious. Yet Trump tonight is doing something different, right? Publicly acknowledging the threat, even though he's ignored some of Medvedev's past warnings of nuclear Armageddon. So, when you take that, plus what we heard from Putin today, the statement you mentioned, taking back what's rightfully ours, it certainly seems to imply, why agree to a ceasefire if we can win militarily in Ukraine? So how is this playing out on the front lines? Yeah, I mean, it's utterly bizarre. Medvedev, someone who's been kind of sidelined, frankly, for the last 3.5 years, and who, when he does make these particularly wide-ranging, apocalyptic threats, is someone with very limited agency inside the Kremlin. Yet, here he is, sparking an unprecedented public discussion of American nuclear assets by a U.S. president. Something that simply hasn't happened before. You wouldn't expect to hear this from the White House clearly, but Trump feels the need to escalate, not wanting the Kremlin to think they can idly threaten the United States. That leads us into a very complicated week ahead, because on August 8, just under 7 days from now, Trump has to decide whether to implement sanctions against Russian allies and energy consumers, which he has threatened to do if Putin doesn't come to the table. Putin, for his part, is returning to his maximalist demands, saying they're taking what's rightfully theirs. This fits the Russian narrative that Ukraine doesn't really exist as a country, which, of course, was the justification for the invasion back in February 2022. He's returning to those broader ideas, not shifting in the slightest. And earlier today, he even said that Trump's disappointment is due to unrealistic expectations. Putin was clear, they're having success on the front lines, something we've been reporting on in recent weeks along the Eastern Front. He's confident that progress will continue, so there's no sign at all, from anything we're hearing out of Moscow, that any kind of successful peace agreement is imminent. That makes all of this nuclear bluster we just heard even more alarming. coming ahead of what could be a decisive deadline next weekend, incredibly fraught and important. Asterisk some Ukrainians, frankly, will hear this and think, this is the United States potentially suggesting military involvement, or at least talking tough to Moscow. And that will lift spirits here. Asterisk sometimes, just using the word nuclear, that rhetoric alone, as you pointed out, is unprecedented, and that may be what matters most. Asterisk thank you both so much. Asterisk the President of the United States today rattled the nuclear saber against Russia, writing on social media, I have ordered to nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions, just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that. Asterisk he was referring to comments from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev about Russia's so-called dead hand system, which could automatically retaliate if an enemy launched a strike on Russia. Asterisk we were just talking about nuclear threats, and when you're talking nuclear, you have to be prepared. And we are. Asterisk joining us now is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Wesley Clark and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. Asterisk good to have you both here tonight. Asterisk General Clark, is this an appropriate response, assuming the president did what he said he did and moved nuclear submarines in response to a social media post? Asterisk actually, it probably plays into the Russian disinformation playbook because it raises the temperature and scares people. And that's exactly what Russia's been trying to do all along. Scare people about nuclear conflict. Asterisk if you want an effective response, you push weapons into Ukraine. Instead, arms shipments have slowed to a trickle. So, you know, this is just rhetoric. But it's rhetoric that Trump may think makes him look strong and tough in front of some supporters. But actually, it works against us and in favor of Russia. Asterisk yeah, it'll be interesting if he does this, but for instance, doesn't impose the sanctions he promised to enforce in a week or so. Asterisk David, if one follows Dmitry Medvedev on social media, it's clear, and I'm sure you've seen this. This is not an isolated comment. He tends to post quite incendiary messages. Asterisk do folks in the national security community here in the U.S. take his comments seriously? Asterisk they don't, Jim. Asterisk you'll remember, Medvedev was the guy who stood in as president when Putin was term limited. He spent a few years in that role, and then Putin returned. Asterisk I met Medvedev once or twice during that time. Back then, he sounded relatively reasonable. He told jokes, didn't seem extreme, didn't seem outside the mainstream. Asterisk these days, he's become a hot-headed internet troll. Though he sits on the Russian National Security Council, he doesn't really hold any power. Asterisk what's interesting here is that the president decided to take the bait. Asterisk you and I have both written about nuclear saber-rattling since the Ukraine war began, but it's always been in the other direction. Putin threatening to use nukes or moving nuclear weapons around, as he did in October 2022. Asterisk we haven't seen this kind of rhetoric from the U.S. before, and that's what makes this moment different. Asterisk yeah, you and I wrote about that back in fall 2022, when there were real concerns the Russians might use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Asterisk General Clark, to you, the concern with these cycles of escalation is that it's not just what's happening, it's what the other side thinks is happening. They may not always be right. They might overreact or underreact. Asterisk so, does this kind of statement create conditions for, maybe not nuclear war, but for dangerous missteps in response? Asterisk absolutely. Asterisk Medvedev is a provocateur, operating under Mr. Putin's instructions. This is part of a long series of statements meant to intimidate the West, deter support for Ukraine, and provide cover for others not to help Kyiv. Asterisk so when we respond with nuclear submarine maneuvers, we're playing into the Russian information war. Asterisk if we really want to move toward a ceasefire and a resolution, we have to act on the ground. We have to stop the Russian advance and convince Putin that he's going to lose more if he keeps going. Asterisk if we're unwilling to do that, if we're afraid, he's going to keep issuing provocative statements. He's going to keep saying, let's not talk about peace, and he'll send forces forward. Asterisk he's got 30,000 North Korean troops lined up behind the front. He's opening a new front through Crimea. Asterisk the big offensive is coming. I guess sometime in September, probably near Odessa. That's the Russian game plan. That's what they've been preparing. Asterisk all the rest of this, it's just noise. Asterisk sanctions aren't going to stop the Russian war machine. Asterisk okay. So we've got a few weeks to do more on the ground. Asterisk David, on that point, are these sanctions actually going to happen this time? Asterisk because, as you know, it's not the first time Trump has set a deadline. The real question is, does this one matter? Asterisk these would be very effective sanctions if they're implemented. Asterisk but to do that, you'd have to penalize China, India, and Turkey, 3 countries that are buying Russian oil, but that also hold significant importance for U.S. policy. Asterisk so the big question is Trump really willing to go up against those 3? Asterisk I have my doubts. Asterisk but maybe we'll find out in a week. Asterisk we'll be watching. Asterisk General Clark, David Sanger, thank you both so much. Hope you have a good weekend. Asterisk.